There's this one phrase from the early days of Christianity that has sparked a massive debate for centuries, having all things common. So, what was it? Was this the first blueprint for communism, or was it something else entirely? Let's figure it out. It's a pretty bold question, right? I mean, the whole idea of a community sharing everything they own, it sounds surprisingly modern. But to really get what it meant, we've got to look at where the idea actually comes from. So, when you first read this passage from the book of Acts, it seems pretty clear-cut. They sold everything and shared it all. But is that really the whole story? Or are we maybe missing a crucial piece of the puzzle? Okay, so let's start by really unpacking this phrase, all things common. What did it actually mean to the people living it? Because as we're about to see, it wasn't some kind of blanket command for every single believer out there. Yeah, this whole practice of giving up all your personal property, it wasn't a universal law that applied to everyone in the church. It was actually a very specific requirement for a very distinct group within that community, which leads us to a really important distinction. See, the early Christian community was basically made up of two groups. You had the appointed ministers, the clergy, and then you had the general congregation, the people. And you guessed it, they had very different rules when it came to property. All right, check this out. This chart really breaks it down for us. On one side, you've got the full-time ministers. These were the people called to serve, so they were required to give up their personal property and live from a communal trust. But then, look at the other side, the congregation. They kept their private property. They still owned their homes and went back to their families. Their way of contributing was totally different. It was through free will offerings. And you know what? This setup wasn't even a brand new idea. It actually echoed the way things were structured in ancient Israel with the Levites. They were the priestly tribe. They didn't have their own land inheritance, and they were set apart to serve the whole nation. So how were they supported? By the voluntary contributions of all the other tribes. This was a system of community service, not state control. So if this wasn't a command for everyone, what was the guiding principle behind it all? Well, it all came down to one core concept: liberty, the freedom to choose. And this freedom created this really powerful cycle of giving. It all started with private ownership. Then, out of charity, not because anyone was forcing them, people chose to give. These offerings were then collected by the ministers, who were like public servants, and they distributed the aid to whoever needed it. The result? A community held together by voluntary love, not by government force. This quote just sums it up perfectly. It was a sharing society? Absolutely. But that sharing was completely powered by individual voluntary choice. This was liberty in action, and it created a social safety net that was fueled entirely by personal sacrifice and charity. And that brings us right to the heart of this whole debate. The difference between a system based on charity and one based on compulsion is just fundamental. So let's clearly define these two opposing ideas. So communism, at its core, it's a political system where all property and resources are controlled by a central authority. The key takeaway here is that the power of choice is taken away from the individual and handed over to the state, or, whoever is in charge. Now, Christian charity, as practiced by the early church, is the polar opposite. The individual keeps ownership of their property, and then, motivated by their own personal conviction and love for their neighbor, they choose to give. The power stays with the person. This is the most important takeaway of all. True sharing can only, and I mean only, come from a free choice. The second that choice is taken away, the moment that sharing is compelled by some external authority, it stops being charity. It becomes a mechanism of control. You see, this distinction isn't just about economics. It's about the very nature of what it means to be human. It's about freedom and identity. The ability to choose is what defines us. The poet Archibald MacLeish captured this idea so well. He wrote, "Without the possibility of choice, a man is not a man, but a member, an instrument, a thing." I mean, think about that. When you take away the right to choose, you're reducing a person to just a cog in a machine, not a free, moral human being. Herbert Hoover made a really similar point. He argued that things like spiritual and intellectual freedom are fundamentally tied to economic freedom, the freedom to own, to earn, and to choose what to do with what's yours. Which brings us all the way back to our original question. The system of the early church was not communism. It was a community built on a core belief that you cannot force morality. True altruism, true community, has to spring from the free and uncompelled choices of individuals. And that leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on. In our complex world, if forcing people to be good isn't the answer, then what is? How do we build a society where people freely choose to care for one another? It's a challenge that's just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. Hey, if you found this explainer helpful, please do us a favor and like, subscribe, and share it with others. If you want to dive deeper, we've put a link to the source article for you in the description. You'll also find a link there to join the living network of Seekers for God's Kingdom. Thanks for watching.